I need to explain something to you about the English language. The English language didn't start out as the English language. It started out as the Celtic language. And then that portion of England was conquered by the German tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, and a bunch of others. And mixing all this whole time are Vikings. They're settling in England, they're conquering little patches of the place. So we've got Scandinavian words, we've got Celtic words, and we've got German words. So it's primarily a German language. That's why they call it Anglo-Saxon. But we don't stop there. We have to keep going because who came in next? Who conquered the island next? Well, the next people that came in were the Romans. And so they dropped all this Latin on those crazy people that were living there. So now we've got four major language groups. We've got the Celts, we've got the Germanic language, we've got the Romance languages with the Latin. We also have Scandinavian languages, which were kind of German, but not quite German. So what happened next? So the Romans were there, and then they left. The Romans left. So now we've got an Anglo-Saxon language that's mixed in with Latin. And the next people that came in were the Normans in 1066. Well, the Normans were actually Vikings, but they spoke French because they had lived in France for about 100 years. They were a group of Vikings that were sitting at the mouth of the Seine River. And the reason they were there was to protect the French from other Vikings, because the other Vikings couldn't conquer them. So they lived in a section called Normandy, and the reason they were called Normandy was because they were Northmen, and it was the land of the Northmen. Okay, but it's French. So now we mix English in with French. So we've got a Romance language, we've got a German language that is changed by Latin, and then it's changed by French. We can mix in a Scandinavian language, and we can mix in the original Celtic language. So it's pretty much, and I say this all the time, but people that actually teach English don't like it. But then again, I taught English, so I can do anything I want. I call it a bastard language because it's just a mixture of one language after the other. It would be as if the Navajo language had a lot of English words in it, had a lot of Spanish words in it. It'd be the same situation.
So it'd be like once one language left, that one picks up, and then
Exactly. So it's pretty much a bastardized language. So what did that do? Well, you've got one section of England that's speaking more of a German language. You've got the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish speaking a Celtic language. You've got the German, you've got the Celtic, you've got the Latins, the people that spoke Latin in the southern portion of England. And here they are, they're trying to communicate with one another. So how do they do it? Well, how they did it was by creating what we refer to as a pidgin language. And a pidgin language is a language that you throw together just so that people can communicate. And the way you do that is by you have your subject of your sentence, which is a noun. Then you add a verb, and then at the end you put a noun. And that's the way the English language works. You have a subject, you have a verb, and then you have a object of the verb. Right? Okay. That's the way it works. And we threw that all together. I mean, that's the way the English language is put together. If you speak any other languages, if you speak German, or if you speak French, or if you speak Spanish, they don't put their languages together like this. They put it together differently. Latin is put together differently. So English was a pidgin language, and we developed as a pidgin language. So what we are speaking today, where we have a noun, we have a verb, and then we have another noun, George shot Sam, noun, verb, noun, that's known as a pidgin language. And that's the way English functions. No other language functions that way, well, except for other pidgin languages. So English is primarily a pidgin language. It's a bunch of languages stuck together, and the only way they could communicate was by saying box, pick, carry, box, carry, there. You know, that's the only way they could communicate with one another, because one guy's speaking French, another guy's speaking Latin, another guy's speaking German, another guy's speaking Celtic. And so that's the way we stuck it together. Because of that, nouns are very important to people who speak English. So for the Western people, especially people that live in England or the United States or Canada or Australia, nouns are extremely important, and that's the way we learn our languages, by learning nouns. So the best way to teach somebody whose primary language is English another language is to teach them all the nouns, and then you add the verbs. Now all of a sudden they can put together a sentence, except it's not grammatically correct, because the French don't do it that way. They put the verb at the end. A lot of people put the verb at the end. The Chinese put verbs at the end. Okay, so in the Western world, the first words that children speak are nouns, and it's because the English language is a pidgin language. Don't say that to Deb Robinson. If you're talking to Emily Green, don't mention that to Emily Green. They'll get all upset. But the reality is, this is the way it's stuck together, and I explained to you the history of why this has happened. And this is another reason why, if English is your primary language, then you may have a difficult time learning Navajo, because Navajo is not put together that way, is it? It's not a pidgin language. You guys have your own language, and it evolved, and it wasn't mixed in with any other language. They didn't force you to speak Navajo with a Spanish accent or anything. And of course, you didn't change your language when the people speaking English came around. Okay. Okay, so I explained to you why nouns are so important. So nouns are really important to people speaking English because it not only is the subject of your sentence, but it's also the object of your sentence. And then you've got a verb in the middle. So we use two nouns for every verb that we use. If you speak Latin, and this is one of the reasons why Latin is so difficult for English speakers to learn, they put their verb at the end. They have all the nouns at the beginning of their sentence, and it gets really confusing. And they have we've got like 8 types of verbs. They've got like 13 or 14. Just really confusing. There's a great deal of evidence that North American children tend to learn nouns much quicker than verbs. And of course, it's very logical. This is the way you probably taught your own kids to speak. You probably said, look at that, that's a ball. And then your child said, ball. And then you said, look at this is a car. Car. This is a dog. And they say, doggy. And so then they start, anything that moves that's not human, they start calling doggy, right? Chickens. That's the way my kids do it. They call everything kitty cat because we had cats. So nouns are far more important to the Western people than verbs are. Chinese children were found to use more verbs than nouns because the verbs are very important. The nouns are sometimes understood in Chinese, so they don't even say them. So their sentences are primarily verbs with an object, but there's no subject to the sentence because the subject is understood. Korean is a different language than Chinese. If you've ever seen Chinese, they don't even use the same, or the Koreans don't even use the same alphabet that the Chinese do. The Chinese and the Japanese use the same, it's not even an alphabet. It's a pictograph. So when they draw a word, it's actually a picture of what they're trying to say. In Chinese, the word for rape this is what it looks like. That's the word for rape. And you say, well, what's that a picture of? It's a picture of 3 women together. So why would there be 3 women in case of rape? There's 3 women because there's 1 woman that was raped and 2 women that are trying to support her. That's the idea. If you think I'm kidding, that's not, that's the way it is. 3 women. And that Japan is, that's Japan. This is the horizon, and this is the island. That's Mount Fuji, and this is the horizon. And the reason you can see it is because it's the land of the rising sun. That's why you can see the horizon. So, I'm sorry. That's the land of the rising sun. Okay. It's a pictograph. But Korean's different. Korean actually has an alphabet. It's called Hangul, and it's a specific alphabet. The Chinese use pictographs, so do the Japanese, but the Koreans actually have their own alphabet, which is kind of interesting. So the Korean language is very much different from the Chinese language, very much different from the Japanese language. Now the odd thing about Korea is that it's been conquered by the Chinese, it's been conquered by the Japanese. It was controlled by the Japanese for an extended length of time, yet they didn't pick up the Japanese language or the Japanese alphabet. The structure of English is such that nouns tend to come in rather salient locations, such as at the ends of sentences, like I said, at the ends and the beginning of sentences. You would never write a sentence where the subject wasn't first and the object wasn't last. You wouldn't put the verb at the end. If you do, it gets very, very confusing. So when we speak in English, of course, we speak with nouns at the beginning and at the end. So nouns are extremely important as far as we are concerned. And we always put the verb in the middle. East Asian languages such as Japanese and Korean tend to place the verbs in salient positions at the ends of sentences. So they actually put their verbs at the ends of their sentences, just like Latin does. Just like almost all the Romance languages. They put their verbs at the end. So if somebody is French and they translate from French to English, they seem to be speaking backwards, like Yoda. Jedi, I am. Yes, you are. Yoda, you're a Jedi. And that's the way the French do it. So if you go up to Canada, if you go up to Canada, the French portion of Canada, they speak in that interesting language that has the verb at the end. They always put the verb at the end, which is kind of funny. Or not funny, I don't know. They also know English, they should know where to put their verbs. Unlike in English, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean languages allow for nouns and pronouns to be dropped when the context is clear. And you hear this all the time. And for that reason, if we write something in English, of course, we put all the words in there. But the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Koreans tend to leave nouns out. They will just drop them because everybody knows what's supposed to be there. When I was living in Nebraska, nobody turned on their turn signal when they were turning the corner. You know why? Everybody knew they were turning that corner. They always turn that corner right there. Same way with the Japanese, Chinese, and the Koreans. Everybody knows what the nouns are supposed to be, so nobody puts them in there. But of course, as English speakers, we want all those words in there. But of course, they leave them out. Now this gets kind of interesting when you're translating Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. Because a lot of times, if you're translating, you want to translate all the words so that you know exactly what they're talking about. But a lot of times they just leave them out, which is kind of interesting. I lived in Japan for about 6 months. It was really kind of interesting because they would translate into English, and they use a lot of English. It's really kind of interesting. So they'll write things in English a lot, but they seem to always leave something out. Normally it's the verb, but sometimes it's the noun. Really kind of fascinating. There's a drink over in Japan called Pocari Sweat. I won't write it down. Pocari Sweat. Would you like a drink of Pocari Sweat? You want a drink called Sweat? Why? What's wrong with sweat? It makes you sweat. That's the idea. When you sweat, you drink this drink. There's a logic to it. It's not an American logic, but there is a logic to it. So when you drink Pocari Sweat.
I like the way coffee sounds.
It tastes like Gatorade. It's clear. It's really kind of interesting stuff. Let's have some sweat. Okay. Anyway, they dropped some things. What they meant to say was Pocari for sweating, I guess. Westerners tend to perceive the world in a more analytic fashion, seeing objects as discrete and separate, whereas East Asians are more likely to perceive the world in holistic terms, stressing the relations between objects. And for that reason, we have a difficult time dealing with things. Just recently, Donald Trump threatened to put tariffs on Chinese goods. Okay, so it's been going on for like the last 6 months. We've been arguing back and forth. What's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? Well, it's really kind of interesting because the Chinese haven't really reacted in a negative manner until yesterday. They put tariffs on $60 billion worth of imports coming into China. The Chinese did, so that ought to be interesting. They hadn't done anything up to this point. And you would think, my goodness gracious, we're threatening a tariff war with the Chinese. They should react somewhat in one way or another. But they didn't react at all until yesterday. They put tariffs on $60 billion worth of American imports. One of those imports is soybeans. Which doesn't mean anything in Navajo country because you guys don't grow soybeans anyway. But I live in a soybean field up in Iowa. I know, I live in a soybean field. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen with all those soybeans? Okay. Well, we're going to have to store them someplace because we can't sell them to anybody. Can't sell them to Chinese because it would cost too much money. There's a tariff on soybeans, which should be interesting because they make a lot of tofu out of soybeans. They make soy sauce out of soybeans. They make a lot of things out of soybeans. They eat a lot of soybeans. Anyway, so who's getting screwed with this deal? And do you care that people from Iowa are getting screwed? No, go Donald Trump, go ahead. $60 billion, that's good. All of it's in soybeans. So what are we talking about? We're talking about analysis. So one of the reasons that they haven't reacted up to this point is because their way of looking at things is more holistic than we are. We can talk about tariffs, and when we talk about tariffs, we're thinking about how it's going to affect me, how it's going to affect the farmers of Iowa. Whereas the Chinese think, they don't think about individuals suffering. What they think about is good for the entire country. And that's one of the reasons why they haven't reacted up to this point. Now they've reacted, of course, with their own version of the tariffs, but it's because they look at things differently than we do. It is plausible that the cultural differences in noun bias reflects this difference in thinking about the world. So as English speakers, where nouns are so important, this noun is very important, and this noun is extremely important to my way of thinking, and because of that, I am more analytic about individual things. I'm not as, I don't have generalistic ideas to help everybody. I want to help me, and I understand individual situations like the whole soybean tariff taking place. So what Trump has proposed to do, he's going to send, $1 billion to the soybean producers. They're losing $16 billion, and he's going to send them $1 billion. They're not all unhappy. Some of them are pretty unhappy. We'll see what happens in the next election. If they go for Trump. Japanese toddlers have been shown to have fewer demands on their parents than their American counterparts and are less likely to assert their disobedience. So they are far better behaved than American children. My daughter has a 6-year-old. My grandson is 6 years old, and he wants to argue everything. Where they're going to eat. He doesn't want to eat there. I know. This was supposed to be the terrible 2s, not the terrible 6s. What the hell's going on? Sorry. What's going on with my grandson and his terrible 6s? He won't agree to do anything. It's really kind of interesting. And it's interesting that he just wants to argue with his mom. He doesn't want to argue with anybody else. So if my wife, his grandma, talks to him, he'll do whatever she wants him to do. But if his mom talks to him, he doesn't want to do anything that she wants to do. I don't know. Maybe it's
Sounds like my nephew.
Oh, there you go. Is he 6?
Yes.
Okay. That maybe it's the first grade or something. Those occasions when Japanese toddlers do act unruly tend not to be viewed as signs of blossoming individuality, as it would be viewed in the United States. We would see it as they are seeking autonomy, and it's good. It's good that they're seeking autonomy. We would see it as individuality, them trying to be individual. But in Japan, they are seen as immature. This is an act of immaturity. So if the child acts out, it is an act of immaturity. So they're acting like a smaller child. That is the way they interpret it in Japan. Same act, same age child, different way of looking at things. The developmental goal embraced by Japanese parents is much less a desire to see their children learn how to be how to individuate and assert themselves, than it is for them to learn how to accommodate to others and to become part of a harmonious social group. Japanese is an extremely crowded country, and because of that, you have to learn to get along with the person right beside you. And if you're in a subway, it's a lot of people, and they're not only right beside you, but they're in front of you and behind you and on all sides. You are surrounded, and you are being squeezed. You feel like you can't breathe. Well, I can't, because I don't like crowds, but the Japanese don't see it that way. The Japanese, we would see it as the child trying to individuate. We need that child to leave home. It's when they graduate from high school, it's time to move out of the house and go someplace else. That's the way we do things, or that's the way we think we do things in the United States. But the Japanese don't see it that way. They see it as teaching the child to be harmonious, teaching the child to get along with everybody else in society. That's more important than anything else. Many cultures demonstrated tendencies for adolescents to act in rebellious ways, familiar to the West. A popular movie on TMC this month is Rebel Without a Cause, one of James Dean's 4 movies that he made. It's a classic. It's about classic rebellion. And this was made in the early 50s. Natalie Wood was his girlfriend, and Sal Mineo was his buddy in that movie. Well, all of them have died by this time, but this is a movie from the 1950s. This is an early teenage angst movie. And the reality is that that's the way we have seen teenagers acting. We accept the fact that teenagers form gangs, that they are different. And we have accepted this since the 1940s and 1950s. So it has come to us from the distant past. That children will be rebellious, and we accept that. Teenagers should be rebellious. And that's the way it's seen in the West. If you go to England, France, Italy, Germany, you see the same thing. You see rebellion. You see people wearing really funny hairdos. When I was in Germany in the late 70s, early 60s, they all had spiked hair. And mohawks. I don't know why they thought that mohawk was... So you had these guys in these mohawks. The punk movement was taking place. This is in the early 80s. The punk movement was taking place, so everybody wore combat boots, which was kind of odd since they were anti-war, but they were wearing combat boots, and they were wearing leather jackets with studs on them, spikes on them, for no reason. And dog collars, yeah, of course the dog collars. It was a great time to be in Germany with all these people walking around. And they tried to speak other languages, really kind of interesting. The word for goodbye was tschüss. They go like this, they wave goodbye like this, not like this, but like this. They wave to themselves. Tschüss, baby, that's what it is. Tschüss was an Italian word. Rather, expectations for such antisocial behaviors were presented in only 44% of societies. They looked at all these societies and they discovered that this whole concept of rebelliousness and anti-socialism only took place in about 44% of the societies. With respect to boys, only 44% as far as males are concerned, only 18% as far as girls are concerned. Girls are far more controlled than boys are in almost every society. So despite the fact that you had a rebellious society, it was only boys that could be rebellious. If you go to England, where the boys are sometimes thuggish, they're hooligans, you never find hooligan females. The girls don't fight. They don't go out and bash people's heads in as odd. I guess it's not so odd. But it was relatively rare for that to happen. However, I've got a picture. My next picture is really kind of interesting. This is a girl from Spain. As you can see, she's shaved half of her head, I think. Maybe she's shaved all of her head except for the very front. I don't know. But here's the Spanish flag over here on her lapel. Not her lapel, but her epaulette. As you can see, she's got studs all over her leather jacket. I don't know about you, but I think it's very attractive. Hubba hubba. It's not like you could hug her. It's kind of like Beetlejuice, if you've ever seen the movie. They'd start to hug him or push him away or something, and all those spikes come shooting out of his body. It would be the same way with this young lady. I was doing educational research in Los Angeles, and one of the individuals was from Spain, and she wore different clothes than everybody else did, but she also had a different hairdo than everybody else did. She had shaved her head and was starting to... She shaved her head because she wanted people to see her hat. She wore different hats every day. And she wanted people to notice her hat, not her hair. So she shaved her head. Who does that? Well, she did, of course. She's from Spain. So we had to go around to all these different schools. Most of the kids that we were talking to were Hispanic. And she, of course, was from Spain, and we had other individuals that were Mexican-American. And, of course, I tried to speak Spanish from time to time in my horrible Hoosier accent. And they made fun of me when I said certain names, because evidently I said it like a swear word or something in Spanish. Cepeda was the word. And people tried to explain to me what I was saying, what I was not saying correctly. Anyway, they made as much fun of the lady from Spain as they did me having a horrible Hoosier accent. And she spoke with a Spanish accent. And in Spain, they speak Spanish with a lisp, which is always kind of interesting. But in Mexico, they don't speak with a lisp, and they make fun of people that do. Anyway, okay, so what are we dealing with here? The majority of cultures studied did not expect adolescents to behave especially disobediently. So if we look at all the cultures around the world, we look at Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, all of those cultures do not see their teenagers as acting out. They don't accept it. It's not the normal way to do things. The notion that adolescence is universally associated with violence received very little support around the world. The only place it received support is in the English-speaking world, which is really kind of interesting, or not. So what do you think as far as your own culture is concerned? The Navajo culture. Do adolescents act out? Do they drink and take drugs? Do they join gangs? Is that traditional or is that non-traditional?
No,
It's non-traditional? Well, so it's the interaction between your culture and the American culture. So they're acting white. Is that what's going on?
Caution, like?
So your adolescents are acting.
I'd say they're at caution.
Is that it's clashing?
I would say.
Not with the cultures. The cultures are agreeing.
The culture of the Western culture. The one picks up,
Oh.
one picks up off the other, feeds off the other.
And your adolescents are accepting the white culture because that's the way they act.
Yeah, so you can like get away with it and you can probably feel from others or your parents. It's not the way, but why is it not?
So what you need to do is shake your finger at those kids and tell them you're acting non-traditional.
You could say that.
I don't know if that would work. I'm not exactly sure that would work. Only 13% of societies expected adolescent boys to occasionally be violent, and only 3% of societies had such expectations for girls. So what society is that? Well, it's primarily the European society. It's my friend from Los Angeles who shaved her head so that people would notice what hat she was wearing. She wore mostly berets, and anyway, she wore a lot of interesting hats. It's kind of interesting. And at first, it was very off-putting, the fact that this lady shaved her head so that people wouldn't notice her hats. And but after you talked to her, it made perfect sense. And by the end of the research, we were really good friends, despite the fact that I thought it was kind of stupid that she shaved her head. By that time, of course, her hair had grown out about this much, so she looked like a soldier right out of boot camp or something. The experiences of adolescence in Germany, Scotland, Japan, Bali, and Batak. Batak is an island in the South Pacific. Bali, of course, is an island in the Indonesian area. They were compared, and the results indicated that both individualism and modernity seem to increase in the difficulties in adolescence in all of these societies. In particular, there appears to be more conflict between children and their parents in individualistic societies where children seem to view parental control as a constraint they must resist. Okay, so the more individualistic the society, the more likely that they will view adolescence as a time of rebellion. Primarily Germany and Scotland in this group. The rest of them are collectivist countries. If you've ever seen the movie Trainspotting, it's about heroin addiction, and for some reason they shoot up and then they go and watch or count trains or watch for trains, or I don't know what they do. There's a new movie out, Trainspotting 2. I know, I'm excited too. The first one was so exciting I could barely stand it. Now I'm dying to see Trainspotting 2. Their accents were so thick that they had to put, they had to write the English underneath. The Scottish accents were so thick, couldn't understand a word they said. It was horrible. There seems to be increased adolescent distress, especially due to the sheer range of opportunities that confront children as societies industrialize and become more urbanized. There's just a lot of things to do. What in the world are you going to do? Well, one of the things you can do is join a gang and become part of a group. That's always fun. One task in adolescence is to learn how to accept adult roles. This is much more straightforward when there are fewer role distinctions and when youth are more in contact with adults as they are in more traditional agricultural societies. So the more adults they're around, the more likely that they will act like those adults. Unfortunately, if those adults are acting in a negative manner, as with gangs and criminality, then they will act in that manner as well. And actually we see that in some of these gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, for example, out of Los Angeles. They will take adolescents and they will
train them to be gang members, to be gang members of their gang. And now the Crips and the Bloods are, geez, these guys must be in their 50s and 60s. But their gangs are still intact because they make a lot of money. And what they're doing is they're training younger individuals. Who was I talking to? They were talking about the gangs. The biggest problem is, in the old days, of course, a leader of a gang could tell somebody, don't do that, and they wouldn't do that. But now the kids are more rebellious, and despite the fact that this guy is the leader of the gang, they're not doing what he's telling them to do. Which means that when they say, you know, don't go out and murder that family, they're going out and murdering the family anyway. And that's one of the problems that they have had in Chicago. Some of the gangs are just, some of the adolescents are just going berserk and shooting people in the street, doing really stupid stuff. And of course, the gangs themselves are trying to crack down on them, but they can't because they don't have any control over them. They're adolescents and adults. This is a parent-child relationship, and they're rebelling against their parents, as strange as that may seem. So what are they doing? The gangs are retaliating against these kids by killing them, or shooting them, by punishing them. They have to punish them. They have to make an example. So a couple weekends ago, they had a huge gang problems in Chicago, and there were like 22 people were shot over the weekend, and it had to do with this whole crackdown on trying to regain control of the gangs. It was horrible. As horrible as that sounds. The number of choices has continued to grow, which has lengthened the period of adolescence, sometimes referred to as failure to launch or emerging adulthood. There was a movie called Failure to Launch, which was not that funny, but it was kind of interesting. He wouldn't move out of his parents' house. He was getting free rent. So he had a good job. He was making lots and lots of money. That wasn't the problem. The problem was he was, I don't know, he was a big baby, I guess. He wouldn't move out of his parents' house because of all the money he was saving, I guess. Anyway, and he'd bring women over and he'd never commit. You know, that was his thing, was not committing. But this is a trend that we've seen in the United States over the last 50 years. The transition of adulthood has been marked by 5 milestones. The first thing is completing school, whether it's high school or college. You get to a point where you can find a job. So it's either graduating from high school or graduating from college. At that point, you leave home. You go someplace and take a job someplace, maybe not in your home, maybe not in your hometown. You become financially independent because now you're working and you're making lots and lots of money, or you're making enough money to survive anyway. You get married, and you have at least one child. And those were the 5 milestones. So the first thing you had to do was complete school. Whether it was high school, in the old days, all you needed to do was graduate from high school and you could get a job in manufacturing. Now there aren't that many manufacturing jobs. So now you need to go to school for at least 4 years past high school, or maybe 2 years past high school. And then you leave home. Hopefully you do anyway. You become financially independent and leave home. Of course, you can't leave home until you become financially independent, but these are all things that you have to do. In the United States in 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had passed all 5 milestones by the age of 30. If you had a young lady that was still living at home at age 30, that had never gotten married, that had never completed school, then if they had never gotten married, then they were considered to be an old maid at age 30. And usually they didn't stay at home. They usually moved out on their own. This is in the 1960s. This is when I was growing up, 50 years ago. In 2000, fewer than half of the women and less than 1/3 of men had done this by the age of 30. 1/3 of the men. Can you say, well, I can't say it, the little girls, so I won't say it. These people are kind of wimpy. I can say that. I can say the word wimpy, I think I can say. a third of the men are they're living with their parents until they're 30 years, over 30 years old. This isn't what used to happen at all. When I graduated from high school in 1967, almost everybody got married. Almost everybody got married. And if they didn't get married, they got pregnant. And then they got married. Anyway, everybody did that. But not now. Nobody gets married. People have babies and they don't get married. But that's okay. It's not that important. But then they stay at home with their parents. It's just different. It's not the same. They live with their parents for an extended length of time. You kind of feel sorry for the parents. I do anyway. Wouldn't want my kids. I raised my kids to get out of there, to leave. That's the way I raised get out of here. You need to leave. As soon as you turn 18, you're out of the house. That's the way I raised my kids, and they both did. They both left at 18, which was kind of nice. They both went to college. And my son moved back for a year, but he did that because my wife was gone. I was living in Oklahoma. My wife had an isolated tour in Korea, and they were afraid that I'd get lonely, so my son moved back. The house was but she was only gone for a year, and then we went to Japan, so he certainly didn't come to Japan with us. He stayed in Oklahoma, as a matter of fact. East Asian children spent more days in school, 240 days per year in Japan versus 180 days per year in the United States. So they spend a lot more days, 60 days a year in school. That's what? That's like 240 days, 365. They also go to school half a day on Saturday. Half a day on Saturday. Whereas we don't do that. They do that all over Asia. When I was in Korea, they would go to school for half a day on Saturday. Tiffany's making a face. How horrible would that be after you go to school on Saturday? Oh my God. I don't know why they took Sunday off. Sunday's not a special day for them. You know, it's just another day as far as they're concerned. They're not Christian, so I don't know why they take Sunday off. A greater percentage of class time was devoted to math education in Asian school day than in the United States. So they study math a lot more than we do in the United States. Asian teachers spend a greater percentage of time lecturing in the classroom compared with their American counterparts. 90% of their time is spent lecturing in Taiwan, compared to 46% in the United States. This is in high school. Asian math lessons, approximately 80% of the examples were real world in Japan, compared with about 10% of examples in American classes. So almost 90% of their questions that they had to answer were word problems, not just raw math. They were word problems, and you had to figure them out. That's the way they did it in Japan and in the Asian schools. So that's one of the differences. So how would you like that? How would you like us to change the way that we teach mathematics so that 90% of your questions would be word problems rather than just problems? Do you think you would enjoy that? Why have we done this in the United States? What's going on? How do we educate people in the United States? We educate you to do specific jobs. I lived in a blue-collar area in Indiana. There were factories all around us. So I was educated to be a factory worker. So when I went to school and they gave me math problems, they were math problems that I would have to solve in the factory. And they only went to a certain level. The reason that they only went to a certain level was because I didn't need more math than that. That's the way I was educated. In my school, they had wood shop, they had metal shop, they had automotive, and everybody had to take those classes. I know. So were they preparing us to go to college? No, they weren't preparing us to go to college at all. They wanted us to go into the factory. All the girls had to take home ec every year. We had to take physical education until we were sophomores. So there was a lot of stuff going on in that school. But they were educating us specifically to go into the factory. And a lot of us did. But I took Latin. Latin was a college preparatory class. At that time, this is back in the 60s, at that time you had to take Latin when you went to college. So I took Latin when I was in high school. In my college, you had to take Greek, except we got away from that the year that I got there. But luckily, I didn't have to take Greek. I don't know if you've ever seen Greek. It's a different alphabet. It's crazy. Anyway, so we educate people for specific reasons. One of the reasons the boarding schools educated you the way that they educated you, they wanted to make farmers out of the males and they wanted to make homemakers out of the girls. So if you look at the curriculum that was taught at the not the tribal colleges, but the boarding schools or the tribal schools, it was all agriculture and home economics. They were educating you for a specific reason, not to go off to college. They just wanted to make you good farmers. So that's the way they educated you. And of course, if you look at the different school systems around the United States, you see exactly the same thing. They educate you for what the jobs are in the area. As insane as that may seem, but the Japanese don't do that. Well, actually they do kind of do that. The Japanese will teach you to pass. What they're trying to do is to get you to pass the college entrance examination. And you have to get a certain score before you can go to high school. You have to get a certain score before you can go to college. So only their best and the brightest are able to go to high school. It's the same way in Germany. There are 2 tracks in high school, or actually it's in junior high school. They have 2 tracks. One of the tracks is a college preparatory track, and the other is to become a factory worker. And you can choose one or the other, but you have to take a test. You have to pass a test in order to go to college. That's why they think it's so weird in the United States that everybody goes to college. So many people go to college. That we have community colleges. They don't have community colleges in Germany. They don't have community colleges in England. That concept doesn't exist. It's extremely competitive. But in the United States, it's not. So we just send our kids to college.
So,
I'm sorry. Please.
so I wonder if the diploma, like getting a diploma, if they go to school here, like the diploma is
Worth less?
Their 8th grade diploma is high school.
Yeah, it actually is. I hate to say that, but it really is. Was that your question too?
No,
No.
my question was, it's like, I see it as more effective there, because here you go to college many years, but on the application, they're not looking for college, like, education as much as they are for skills.
Right.
Experience.
Right.
So what's the use of going to school?
What's the use of going? Why are you here? Is that what you're asking yourself? Why am I here? What am I
But
doing?
it is like based more off of skills and experience nowadays rather than.
It all depends. Yeah, and everything's changing. It's changing every day. All of this stuff is changing. I was talking to my son the other day, and he was complaining about. He teaches mathematics for non-English speaking people. Okay. So he teaches all these kids from all over the place. This is down in Florida. Most of his kids speak Spanish, but some of his kids speak Portuguese. And some of his kids are Haitian, so they speak French. So here he is, this kid that just graduated from college. He's 47 years old, and he graduated from college like 3 years ago. Here he is, he's teaching these kids in 3 different languages besides English. And he does speak Spanish. He learned Spanish playing soccer. So you can imagine the words that he learned.
You see it in movies too, like more and more movies are made as where they're, like America's bringing students from like Asia over to to how with like a lot of research that they're doing here. You see the movies too, like modern day movies.
Right.
Like it's
Why do we have to do that?
I don't know. Maybe they want more people to go to college here.
Well, the reality is we don't have people of the high enough quality to do the research. So we have to bring people over from overseas. I know. So.
We're not lazy.
They're saying like the next person to probably cure cancer and everything else probably would be somebody of that ethnicity.
Right. And it may be Asians are really good at mathematics. Why? Well, I just told you why. Because they go to school longer, and the mathematics they get is of a higher quality than ours.
So would their attention span be longer as well too?
They don't have as much ADHD or ADD. The reason is because their parents tell them that they have to do this. This is socially acceptable for you to do this. Whereas American kids, my goodness, we don't tell our kids anything. You have to study mathematics. Oh, don't worry, you got a C. That's okay. That's good enough. You passed, right? That's all I want. But the Asian kid, if they miss one question on a test, then their parents just come down on them. They just rip them apart. And they will remind them that they missed, well, you're not perfect. You missed that one question. You should have done better. That's the way the Asian parents treat their children. So perfection is something that they actually achieve, or they come closer to perfection than certainly Americans do.
Yeah, because here it's like 5th grade math, 6th grade math is tough to our parents. Most of them didn't finish high school.
Oh, you mean on the reservation? Well, not only that, but they're teaching all these mathematics differently than they did in the past. I don't know if you've tried to...
They use rocks and sticks now.
Well, in the past, we just added up numbers. Now they talk about, I don't know. My son talks about this all the time. He says everything has changed completely. Mathematics education is just not the same as it used to be. Not that it's dumber, but it's theoretically they're trying to guide them into algebra and calculus earlier, which makes it a lot more complicated. Anyway, so they do things differently than we do. Even the parents, their expectations are different. Asian teachers assign more homework to students. Students hate homework. You guys hate homework. You got stuff you're supposed to do in here. Are you turning it in every week like good girls and boys? Of course. Do I care? No, because then I have to grade it. So what's going to happen is you're going to turn in all of your stuff at the end of the year, at the end of the semester, and I'm going to have to grade it like 2 weeks before the end of the semester. I'm going to have to grade it. Then I'm going to have Edison sending me an email, oh, please grade my stuff. This is supposed to be finals week, and this was supposed to be in last week. There we go. So, no, Edison wouldn't do that to me. He always turns his stuff in early. Thank you, Edison. I appreciate it. Please grade my stuff. I won't do this next semester, I promise. Yes, you will. You do it every semester. 5th graders in the United States have less than half as much homework assigned to them as Taiwanese students. If you go to an Asian household, they're working on their homework all the time. And even if they don't have homework, they're reading ahead because that's what their parents make them do. In the United States, what are your kids doing? Well, they're playing video games until about 9 o'clock, and then at 9 o'clock, then they start their homework. Then they get so tired that they have to go to bed, and they didn't quite finish their homework. So they get up the next morning, and they just kind of scribble it out, something, anything. Okay. Or maybe they started playing video games when they got up the next morning, and you had to get them off the video games to finish their homework. Now it's time for them to go to school. They're about halfway through. That's the way it works. But in Asian countries, it doesn't work that way. The kids do their homework. Asian parents seem to view education as more central to their children's lives than American parents do. This is fascinating. They did research looking at, well, not yet. In a minute, we'll talk about some of the research they did looking at American students and Asian students. Asian parents are more likely to provide their children with a desk. One study revealed that 98% of Taiwanese fifth graders had a desk in their home, compared with only 63% of American kids. This is really important. This is the place where you do your work. And in Taiwan, of course, no matter if that's the only piece of furniture in the house, the kid has a desk to sit down and do their homework. In the United States, where do your kids do their homework? At the dinner table, of course. Right? They don't have a special place. But they have a special place for their video game. And not only that, but it's one of those huge television sets. It's this massive big screen television. And that's where they play their video games. They need the person to be actual size. That's what they want to see. Anyway. What's happening? One study revealed that 98% of... Oh, I already talked about that. Okay, so desks are really important as far as your kid is concerned. Your kid will go to college and try really, really hard if you give them a special place to do their homework. Do you believe that? No? You don't believe it? If you make them do it at the dinner table, that means it's not important. So you have to give them a special place to put their books and do their homework. That's what you need to do in the United States.
They just feel more organized too.
I'm sorry?
I think they just feel more organized.
Yeah, exactly. Sure.
It helps them want to do the work because everything is right there.
Exactly. They don't have to move their books in order to eat supper that
Grease spots on the table.
Exactly. Then they have to recopy their homework because it's got grease spots all over it.
My cousin's sister does that to my nephew, my other nephew.
Oh.
He's 7.
Not the one that acts out and wants to argue all the time. The other one.
He's more prone to my cousin's sister's husband. You know, he's used to him. He'll only do what he says.
Oh.
So he makes him work. And my cousin's sister, her own son, has a special study place.
Has a special study place. The most important thing.
She makes him read. So he's like reading. They have these challenges. Was it 100 book challenge, 200 book challenge?
See, that's what I'm trying to make you guys do. I'm trying to make you read a book. I apologize for the tiny boy.
Start off with the 1 book challenge.
How is it? 100? Actually, 100 step challenge, and then 200, and then 500 step, and then 700.
Oh, wow. That's a
So
lot of
my
books.
nephew is at 200.
200. He's at 200.
Yes.
Fantastic.
But I think it's that feeling of like the parents care enough to give the child that space.
Exactly.
So it's like important that child feels like it's important that they do what for them to like give them that
Right.
space and help them.
I agree.
It motivates them to do the work.
My family, it was encyclopedias. We had a set of encyclopedias. And the only place that you could find encyclopedias were at the library or at the high school, or at the school. And we had a set of encyclopedias. So we felt special. So we thought that we all had to succeed. Well, some of us did anyway. I did. I thought I had to
How
succeed.
many siblings do you have?
I'm sorry?
How many siblings do you have?
5.
And you're the only one that's received?
Oh, no. I had a
It's like
sister that was a
crazy.
lawyer. My next brother was he graduated from college. He has a master's degree. My next sister became an airline stewardess. When she got married, that's it. She just got married. My next brother was a surveyor. He was a surveyor. And then my baby brother, who had the highest IQ of everybody in the family, didn't do jack squat. Nothing. Laziest person in the whole wide world. I don't know what was wrong with that kid. Smart as a whip, knows everything. Didn't ever do anything with his life. Nothing. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army Reserve, or Army National Guard or something. That's it. That's all he ever did in his life. Nothing else. Bachelor's degrees as far as he went. The rest of us got master's degree. I've got a PhD. I've got a sister with a law degree. And here's my brother with nothing. What a bum.
He's retired.
What a waste. No, it's a waste. It was a waste of potential is what it was. And I never could figure it out. But then again, he grew up during the hippie era. So he kind of fit into that mold, and he bounced back and forth between the Army and growing his hair long. Now he's got this long gray ponytail, which makes him look like an idiot. And he just got drowned out in South Carolina, so we'll see what happens. This is the fascinating research that I was talking about before. Stevenson in 1992 asked fifth graders to imagine that there was a wizard who could grant them anything that they wished. Anything that they wished for, they would get. So they asked this of Chinese students, and about 70% of the Chinese students wished for educational success. They wished for to be able to go to college. They wished to get high grades in school. 70% of the school kids. In contrast, only about 10% of American children wish for things relevant to education. Only 10%. 10% of the American children wish for less school. So we have all these Chinese students wishing for educational success, and we have American students wishing that school would go away so that they could play their video games. Well, this is in 1992. It probably wasn't video games, was it? It was probably something else. The East Asian children are doing much better as a group on math tests than the American children. Thus, one might expect East Asian mothers to be especially satisfied with their children's performance. This does not seem to be the case. Rather, the American mothers report being far more satisfied with their children's performance than the East Asian mothers are. So we will accept mediocrity in the United States as Westerners. We accept mediocrity. As long as you pass, I don't really care. But as far as East Asians are concerned, even A's aren't good enough for those people. They want their children to be perfect. And they'll tell them so. Compared with mothers of first grade children, Chinese and Japanese mothers of fifth grade children reported that a higher standard of achievement was necessary for them to be satisfied with their children's math performance. So even success wasn't success as far as they were concerned. In stark contrast, the standards of American mothers were lower for fifth grade children than for their first grade children. So despite the fact that the math is getting more difficult, you should be expecting them to do better. The American mothers didn't care. They didn't care at all. Chinese and Japanese mothers, they cared. And they told their kids about it. It appears to be far easier to meet standards of American mothers than East Asian mothers. This would suggest that American children have less reason to work hard at their studies than East Asian children do. Numbers are harder to learn in English than in Japanese, Korean, or Chinese because there are more irregular number words in English, so it's harder for people to learn mathematics and English. And that's one of the things my son was saying. He was telling me that it's hard for these kids. Spanish is a very standardized language. It's very standardized, and you pronounce words exactly the same as they look. So anybody can pronounce Spanish if you know how to pronounce the words. In English, you never know. I mean, you can have the same series of letters, and sometimes it's pronounced one way, and sometimes it's pronounced another way. English is very non-standardized, very, very difficult. Even I struggle with it sometimes, and I've been reading for 65 years. It's tough. Some of these words fool me. Sometimes I have to look them up. I had to look up salient to make sure I was pronouncing it correctly. What makes that A long? S-A-L-I-E-N-T. Why is that A long? Why is it pronounced salient and not salient? Why is it pronounced that way? Because it's Latin, of course. Remember, I told you,
But the English language comes from the Germanic language, the Celtic language, the Latin, French, and Scandinavian. So sometimes the words are Scandinavian, so they're pronounced the way Scandinavians would pronounce it. Sometimes it's a Latin word, so it's pronounced the way the Romans would pronounce the word. Sometimes it's a French derivation. In English, we have two sets of words for just about everything. We have a German word, and then we have a French word, which is the nice way of saying things. And I'm not going to, there's a lot of swear words that go back and forth. But we won't talk about that today. Remind me next time, and I will tell you some of those swear words. They're kind of a lot of fun. One of them is manure. You guys know what manure is? It's a nice way of saying that stuff, right? Manure? Isn't it nice? Right? There are other words that don't have... Manure is a French word. It means what it means.
So do they say it like that?
Manure. Actually, in French, it's merde, which is, well, merde's actually a swear word in French, but we won't talk about it. Anyway, that's a nice way of saying that word, and you all know what manure is. So you know what the other words are, and they're not French, okay? The Latin word for it is feces. You may have heard that word before, feces. This is the Latin word for the same substance, right? Feces and manure, those are all acceptable terms. You know, they're not considered swearing. Just about everything else is a swear word for that substance. And those are all German words. So when people say, pardon my French, the reality is you should be pardoning their German, because it's the German word that is the unacceptable word, okay? Pardon my French. Yeah. The French is always the acceptable word, because in the English courts, remember the Normans took over England in 1066, so all the language that they brought in the English courts, they took over the aristocracy. It was all in French. So all the English courts were French and Latin. So all the Anglo-Saxon they were the negative terms. They were, that was the common way of saying things. And so all the swear words you know today are probably German in derivation. But we won't go into any of those. Not good today. We won't use those. East Asians' county systems incorporate the base 10 concept, which is necessary for learning how to do multi-digit arithmetic in a more straightforward way than English does. My son is taking cryptography. Cryptography is, we need to be able to understand how the Russians are putting things together, how the Chinese are putting things together. One of the interesting things is that when they're studying cryptography, they have to study in a base 10. Well, English is in a base 10 as well, but it's a lot more difficult to understand English base 10 than it is East Asian base 10. English speakers need more conceptual support for their base 10 concepts than do speakers in East Asian languages, so you would think that we would spend more time on it, but we don't spend hardly any time on mathematics at all, as sad and strange as that may be. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Let's start a new chapter. Why that? Why not? I almost said something else. Manure. I almost said manure. Oh, man. Shoveled a lot of manure when I was young. Lived on a farm. Lots of cows, lots of pigs, lots of manure. Which is a nice way of saying something else. The 20 statements test is really kind of interesting. What you do is you tell people who you are in 20 statements. I am short. I am old. That's something that I would say. But you have to do it in 20 different statements. And they have used this psychological technique all around the world.
to identify people or to find out how people identify themselves. In the United States, we do it in a really specific way. We brag about ourselves. But in other countries, they don't. They don't brag nearly as much as we do. Really kind of interesting. Americans most often mention personal traits, attitudes, and abilities, which accounted for 48% of self-description. You would say I am Navajo, I would say I am white, I am old. These are all specific things that fit our self-description. That's the way we do it in the United States. The American pattern is similar to many other Western cultures, especially Australia, Britain, the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden and Canada, the English-speaking places in the world. However, if you go to other cultures, you ask them the 20 questions, they don't mention the same things that we do. When cultural groups are given the same measure, the results are very much different. The Maasai and Samburu of Kenya had only 2% of their self-descriptions reflect personal characteristics. I am tall, I have a long nose, I'm bald on top. Those are all personal things that I might potentially say. But when they describe themselves as who they were in their group. 60% of their descriptions encompass their social membership and their roles. So they would say, I'm a hunter, and I hunt for my group or something. I'm a healer, and this is who I am. I'm accepted as a fast person by my social group. The Maasai and the Samburu pattern of greater emphasis on roles and memberships appears in the cultures from much of the rest of the world, and these cultural differences are already evident among kindergarten children. So even if you give the 20 questions to kindergarten children on the Cook Islanders, the Malaysians, the Chinese, Native Americans, other Africans, Puerto Ricans, Indians, Japanese, they all identify themselves by their group, as their group. And that's exactly what you do. When you talk about yourself, you talk about your clans. You describe yourself by your clans. And that's what the rest of the world does. English-speaking people, people from Scandinavia, they brag about personal attributes about themselves. But the rest of the world doesn't. They are more collectivist. And since they are collectivists, they see themselves as part of the group. And that's how they identify themselves. A Danish study by Ma et al. This guy's from Denmark, and his name is Ma. Do you find that odd? Ma. Is that a Danish name? Does that look Scandinavian to you? Ma is a Chinese word that means either mother or it means mule. I know, it all depends on what inflection you put behind it. If you say ma, it's your mother. If you say ma, it's your mule. So this is a Chinese guy in Denmark doing research. Okay, there we go. Or maybe it's a Danish lady that married a Chinese guy. I don't know how this stuff
Is that vice president that's running? His name is Boo Nygren.
Boo?
Yeah, B-U-U.
B-U-U? Okay, that's an interesting way to spell boo.
He was at the parade. We went to the parade in One Rock. He's like, everyone say boo. And everybody's confused, like. He was like, my name is Boo Nygren.
That's so cool. Nygren, of course, is Scandinavian. Nygren is. Nygren? Okay. Boo is not. I'm
So
not sure.
he's already made with Joe Shirley. And there's this sign that it says Shirley Nygren. And my mom was like, who is Shirley Nygren?
It sounds like a lady, yeah. Well, let's see if Boo wins. Did Boo, he's not in the...
Yeah, he is, him and there's two.
Oh, Shirley and
Shirley
and
Nygren.
Nez.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. Now I remember. Okay. Anyway, so Ma did research in 2012 in Denmark. He looked at functional MRIs when participants were evaluating personal characteristics. The Danish participants showed no difference in their functional MRIs when they considered their social roles or their personal characteristics. Both involve the medial prefrontal cortex, which is typically activated in self-judgment. So here we had this situation where they were looking at not only who they were personally, individually, but they were also looking at what their job was in society. And the same area of their brain lit up. That was in Denmark. However, then they did the same research with the Chinese. Remember, this guy's name was Ma. Bu Ma, I don't know his name. When the researchers performed the same functional MRI on Chinese participants, their medial prefrontal cortex was only activated when they were considering personal characteristics. When the Chinese thought of their social roles, their temporal parietal junction was activated. That's this section right here. This is the temporal parietal junction. This is a region that more typically is involved in understanding other people's beliefs. So when they were thinking of their who they were in society, they were trying to see themselves, they were trying to read themselves in what other people thought about them. And that's the way collectivists do things. And that's one of the reasons why you try to get along with everybody in your society. Because you see yourself as a reflection of what other people think of you. In Denmark, they didn't, when they thought of what other people, when they thought of their societal role, they didn't care what other people thought of them. But in China, of course, that is very important. Remember, in China, if somebody doesn't do well in school, they still pass. And the reason they still pass is because they are advanced with the rest of their class. They don't want to separate them from the rest of the students in their class. If you are an exceptional student and extremely important and extremely smart, you will not ever, you will always advance with the rest of your class, despite the fact maybe you should skip a grade or whatever. But that's the way it works in, the way it works in China is that you think of yourself in terms of what other people are thinking of you. Do you even care what other people are thinking of you? How many people care what other people are thinking? No, nobody? Am I the only one? Okay, I really don't either. So my temporal parietal junction wouldn't be activated either if I was trying to figure out where I was as far as the people of Dene College were concerned, whether they're going to fire me or not. I can retire anytime, anyway. I'm so old I can retire and start getting Social Security. That's how old I am. Why don't we stop right here? We'll pick this up next time. Remember, 2 areas of your brain that are activated. One area where you worry about what other people think of you. And we as Westerners, we never react to that.